For centuries, people have been trying to peel back all the layers of faith and tradition to find the actual man, at the heart of Christianity, Jesus of Nazareth. But this academic quest, the search for the historical Jesus, well, it's in a really fascinating state of upheaval right now. So let's dive into why the very foundation of this search seems to be cracking.
This is the question, isn't it? Who was the real Jesus of history? And just to be clear, we're not talking about Jesus the Christ, the figure of faith. We're talking about the man who actually walked the roads of first-century Galilee. And what's wild is that today the answers scholars are coming up with are more varied and honestly, more contradictory than they've ever been.
This quote just hits the nail on the head. It's from a review of a big international meeting of experts, and it perfectly captures what's going on. For decades, scholars kind of had a general agreement, a consensus. But today, that is totally collapsed into what one expert calls a chaos of opinions.
Okay, so a field in chaos. Why? Why can't scholars agree anymore? Let's really unpack why that old consensus just completely fell apart. We're going to look at some of the key findings from that big international meeting of experts I mentioned, and you'll see the new ideas that are shaking this entire field right down to its core.
All right, so let's get into the 4 big shifts that have changed everything. A scholar named James H. Charlesworth, he's pointed out 4 massive paradigm shifts. And what's a paradigm shift? It's basically a fundamental change in how you think about something. These 4 shifts have completely rewired how researchers even approach the historical Jesus. Let's break them down.
Okay, first up, our whole understanding of the world Jesus actually lived in has just exploded. For a long, long time, the picture was pretty simple. People thought, okay, first-century Judaism had 4 main groups. That's it. But the new view? It was this incredibly diverse world with more than 20 different groups, subgroups, and sects. I mean, just try to imagine Jesus navigating a religious and political world that complicated and full of conflict. It changes everything.
So thinking about that more complex Jewish world, that completely reframes one of our most important sources, the Gospel of John. Now, you might know John as the one that's super theological, maybe the least historical. And for a long time, scholars saw it as totally disconnected from, or even hostile to, Judaism. But the new consensus? It does a complete 180. It says the only way to truly understand the Gospel of John is to see it as a text created within the world of Judaism. All right, this third shift really builds on the first 2. You see, for ages, the search for Jesus was, well, it was mostly about finding the origin story of Christianity. Scholars were looking backward through a Christian lens, kind of like looking through a stained glass window. But now, the big push is to understand Jesus firmly within his own world, his own context. That means seeing him as a figure of what's called Second Temple Judaism. It's about seeing him as a product of his time, not just the starting point for a future religion.
And the 4th shift, wow, this is a big one. The old way of thinking was that all the really powerful ideas about Jesus, his divine nature, what scholars call Christology, that stuff must have been developed way later, long after he died. But now, a lot of experts are calling that idea absurd. They're arguing that the most likely source for these incredible ideas was Jesus himself. That's a huge deal, because it pulls the origin of these core beliefs way, way closer to his actual lifetime.
Okay, so let's pause for a second. With this totally new context, a more complex world, these core ideas starting earlier, what kind of picture of Jesus starts to emerge? Who does he become in this new light? Let's take a look at the new portraits that are taking shape.
So there are a few new understandings that are really gaining traction. 3 of the big ones paint a picture of Jesus as, first, an itinerant teacher, basically a wandering teacher, always on the move. Second, as a subversive interpreter of Scripture, someone who radically challenged the way people were reading their own holy texts. And third, as a challenger of purity rules, someone who broke major social and religious boundaries.
Let's just dig into that first one for a second, the itinerant teacher. This is way more than just saying he moved around a lot. A scholar named Gerd Thiessen has this really interesting idea that Jesus' lifestyle was shaped by a few things. His job as a carpenter, which would have involved travel, and by older figures like the prophet Elijah, who was also a wanderer. And here's the cool part. This connects his constant movement to his actual message, a radical message that welcomed women and foreigners, people who were usually pushed to the margins by society's rigid rules.
So get this, the search for Jesus isn't just happening in dusty old books anymore. Now the hard sciences are jumping into the game. We're talking about archaeology and topography, which is the study of the actual landscape. And these fields are adding these incredible new layers of detail that are literally changing how we read the Gospels. So when we talk about a view from the ground, we mean it.
There's this new focus on Galilee, which was Jesus' home turf. And by digging in, literally, researchers are uncovering this very distinct local Jewish identity and figuring out how it fit into the bigger economic picture. And sometimes, the clues are just amazing. You know the story of Jesus turning water into wine? Well, details in that story, like the specific kind of stone jars that were used, match up perfectly with what archaeologists have been digging up from first-century Galilee. How cool is that? Okay, so we've got all these new ideas, all these new scientific clues. You'd think we'd be getting closer to some kind of new agreement, right? A new consensus? Well, not so fast. The very research that's giving us all these new insights is also getting hit with some heavy criticism. It just proves this quest is far, far from over.
So what's the big critique? Well, that big symposium we've been talking about, the main knock against it is that, for all its cool and fascinating ideas, it just doesn't give you the whole picture. One reviewer basically said it fails at its main goal, to really assess what's happened in the field over the last 25 years, because it leaves some of the biggest, most important voices completely out of the conversation.
And we're not talking about minor players here. The voices left out are absolute giants in this field. We're talking about E.P. Sanders, John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, N.T. Wright, and others. I mean, trying to discuss the search for the historical Jesus without even touching on their incredibly influential work, it leaves this huge gaping hole. And that incompleteness, that's a major reason why the field is still in that chaos of opinions.
So, after all of that, the big shifts in thinking, the archaeology, the new portraits, the critiques, where does that leave us? Where does it leave the search for the historical Jesus? If the old consensus is totally broken and there's no new one even on the horizon, what is this whole quest really telling us?
You know, maybe the most powerful insight comes from a scholar named Albert Schweitzer, and he wrote this over 100 years ago. He said scholars inescapably fashion the image of Jesus in their own image and likeness. Think about that. He was suggesting that every time someone tries to find the historical Jesus, they end up creating a Jesus that looks, well, a lot like them. So maybe this whole quest tells us just as much about ourselves and about our own time as it does about a man who lived 2,000 years ago. And that is a thought to really let sink in.